bill to speed it up just a little and be done at least by 2:15, because the Taos School Zone is going to do some kind of a survey. I don't know what the survey questions are. I don't know what it's about, but it's okay. So we just want to thank you so much, Palms and Associates. They don't even charge us, and they're some of the best in the nation. So I just want to say thank you for being here. We do need this. Sexual harassment training is mandated for us. We realize that, but we're taking it seriously.
Thank you, Dr. Torres. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Larry Beagle. I'm one of the senior risk managers with Palms and Associates. Palms and Associates is the contractor that works with the New Mexico Public School Insurance Authority, NMSDA, to provide loss control services. We're also the insurance broker that handles all the insurance policies, property, liability, workers' compensation, auto insurance, for all the public school districts throughout the state, with the exception of Albuquerque Public Schools. APS has their own risk management, their own insurance, or their own deal. All other 88 school districts, over 100 charter schools, and several colleges and universities participate in a self-insured insurance program called NMSDA. We contract with NMSDA to provide services like loss control. I'm one of the senior risk managers on that team. I've been doing this for about 6 years. I've been with Palms and Associates for 11 years. I'd like to take a minute and recognize your maintenance crew. That's an outstanding award that you guys received. The criteria for that award, I'd like to know that I work with school districts throughout the state, and it's no easy task what they did. The criteria for that award is very rigorous. They go through standards through the Public School Finance Authority. They inspect the schools. They come out and take a look at the work orders, how quickly they're doing things, how much they're maintaining, how often they're doing all their preventative maintenance. So win that award is a testament to the hard work and dedication of that team. So taking a minute again to recognize that crew did. And the hard work that goes into a gospel. That's amazing. So thank you very much for allowing me to kind of talk to you on Halloween and with these two prestigious awards that your district has been recognized for. Now the fun stuff. Let's talk about sexual harassment. On Halloween. So, anyhow, my name is Larry Beagle. We're going to jump into this. I was out here last year when we did this training, so I recognize a lot of you, see a lot of familiar faces out here. I'm actually from this part of the state, so I actually have some relatives out here. So it's great to be in Taos. I love coming to Taos every opportunity I can. My disclaimer, what this says is I'm not a lawyer. Even though it's Halloween, I'm not dressed as a lawyer. I didn't stay at a Holiday Inn Express last night. I'm not an attorney. I'm not providing you legal advice today. I'm providing you loss control or preventative measures that you can use to take to help prevent a sexual harassment, Title IX lawsuit, or that type of claim from affecting your district. And it's important to talk about that because, as Dr. Torres said, this is a mandatory training. The state of New Mexico requires that all educators participate in this type of training at least annually. We do offer this online as well, so those of you that would rather do that kind of training, we offer that training online at no charge also. So that's another alternative for you if this kind of live training is not of your cup of tea. So my contact information is on here. I also have my business cards if any of you would like to take that. If you have any questions that you'd like to ask me about that you don't have a chance to talk about today, I'd be happy to answer anything that I possibly can. But again, we work for the Public School Insurance Authority, and that's our main objective there. So, there's two thoughts that we're talking about here when we're talking about sexual harassment in schools. And the two major laws that affect sexual harassment in education are, first of all, the employment laws, which are federal laws. And again, this is mandatory for all employees because it is a federal law. It is the Civil Rights Act of 1964, which created Title VII. Under Title VII, they administered the Eeoc, or the Equal Employment Opportunity Commission. The Equal Employment Opportunity Commission investigates complaints, allegations, claims of any sort of employment-related harassment, discrimination, wrongful termination, hostile work environment. All of your employment-related claims can go through the Eeoc. They're a board who helps determine and investigate whether or not those allegations are truthful or not. And they can assess fines to the employer depending on their findings. The other thing that we want to look at in this training is the Education Act. The Education Amendments of 1972, which created Title IX, which is administered to the Office of Civil Rights through the Department of Education. How many of you have heard of Title IX before? What do you typically think of when you hear about Title IX? Sports, athletics. Most people associate Title IX with athletics because it does play a big part in especially intercollegiate athletics. Title IX is what kind of helps or mandates that we have equal opportunity among different sexes for opportunity to participate in athletics, and that's where it's in the headlines. But actually, Title IX is a lot more important than that. Title IX was created, and Title IX has recently been challenged up to the Supreme Court level with regard to opportunity for education in an environment that's free of harassment. And so that's why it's also important to talk about in this type of training for educators. We want to make sure that we're providing not only our employees with an environment that is free from harassment, free from discrimination, but also your students, because that's who's affected by Title IX. Kids who go to school in your district. And under Title IX, that law says they have a right to an education that's free of that type of behavior. And so we're going to talk a little bit more about that. Those are the two main things that we want to focus on here. Under Title VII, under the EEOC definition of sexual harassment, it clearly defines sexual harassment as any unwelcome sexual advance, request for sexual favors, and other verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature when submission to such conduct is made explicitly or implicitly a term of employment or condition of employment, which is known also as a quid pro quo. You've heard that term recently. Submission to or rejection of such conduct by an individual is used as the basis for an employment decision affecting such individuals, or such conduct has the purpose or effect of unreasonably interfering with an individual's work performance by creating an intimidating, hostile, or offensive work environment. That's a mouthful. That's the definition of sexual harassment under Title VII. And you see in there a lot of reference to sexual advances, sexual favors. So this is conduct that's predominantly of a sexual nature. However, if you look at that last line, if the conduct can create a hostile or offensive work environment, that's a kind of catch-all phrase that catches a lot of our behaviors, makes us really want to think twice about the types of jokes we're telling, the type of behaviors that we're exhibiting, the way we're treating one another in the workplace. And so we'll talk a little bit more about that. Let's look at the Title IX definition for sexual harassment. Under Title IX, the Department of Education, the Office of Civil Rights, they define sexual harassment as verbal or physical conduct of a sexual nature imposed on the basis of sex by an employee or an agent of the institution that denies, limits, provides different or conditions the provision of aid, benefits, services, or treatment protected under Title IX. So it's not making much reference to our workplace there, is it? It's talking about the education environment, and that's where the treatment of each other, the way kids treat each other, the way we treat kids in schools is affected under Title IX. We have to make sure that the environment that we're creating is not one in which it's denying, limiting, or making different the conditions or provision of aid, benefits, or services in education. And that's where Title IX really comes into play in the schools. Not necessarily in athletics, but also in the way that we treat each other. The EEOC reports every year they have at least 15,000 claims of sexual harassment. Sounds pretty low, but on an annual basis, that's the number of claims that make it to the EEOC. 40 to 60% of women experience sexual harassment in the workplace, and 16% of men report sexual harassment in the workplace. I think we're starting to see those numbers increase as we're seeing more awareness about this kind of conduct. We're starting to see more people be willing to talk about what bothers them in the workplace, be bringing out that type of information. So it's not something that's just kept in a dark room somewhere. We're actually bringing these topics out and talking about it, which is important. It's great that that's happening because hopefully it's affecting our behavior. It's changing behaviors in the workplace. There are two types of harassment that we talk about under sexual harassment under Title VII. That's quid pro quo and hostile environment. Under quid pro quo, you have to receive a benefit, or something has to be received in exchange for something. It's a Latin term. It's exchange for something for a favor or a benefit. Employment decisions, expectations for hiring, promotions, salary increases, work assignments, performance evaluations. All these are based on the employee's willingness to grant or deny sexual favors. And there's no distinction under quid pro quo between resisting and submitting. So even if somebody submits to the request for the favor, that doesn't make the request for that favor right. It's still wrong if that decision for employment was made based on the receipt of that favor. Does that make sense? I see a lot of nodding heads. Good. Hostile environment occurs when verbal or nonverbal behavior in the workplace that focuses on sexuality of another person or occurs because of a person's gender is unwanted, it's unwelcome, it has to be severe and pervasive enough to affect the person's work environment. If these conditions are met, then you have what's considered a hostile environment. Under those Eeoc claims that I talked about, many of the hostile environment claims are the ones that are more likely to be proven or to be brought to action by the Eeoc. We're actually seeing less of the quid pro quo type of claims. It's more of the hostile environment. It's how you're making somebody feel in the workplace. It's easier, it's harder to disprove how somebody feels, right? So the judgment there is always going to be on the basis of how that information is being received by the other party. So let's talk a little bit more about this. How do you know if your conduct is unwelcome? How do you know if the behavior that you're exhibiting is either welcome or unwelcome by somebody?
Verbally tell you, get away.
Yeah. They might verbally tell you, leave me alone. No, I'm not interested. No. That's an unwanted behavior. That's an outright rejection. What are some other ways that people can reject your behavior or show you that their behavior is not welcome? How about some nonverbal ways? Body language. Yeah. If they're not looking you in the eye, if they're walking away from you when you're telling those jokes. Oops. Right. I'm sorry. So, body language. What are some other nonverbal cues? How about on this side? Knock them out. Yeah, maybe it's a physical altercation that could occur, right? Somebody grabs you and slaps them across the face. That's a clue that they're not interested, right? Not necessarily a suggestive way, maybe, but just that. Yeah, they might cry. They may go leave the room, go talk to somebody. Their behavior changes based on your behavior. That's a clue to you that your behavior is not welcome. It's not wanted. Why is that important? It's important because that's the condition that needs to be met in order for sexual harassment to occur. The conduct has to be unwelcome, has to be unwanted. Is the conduct severe enough to create a hostile environment? How do we know if our conduct is creating a hostile environment? Is it a hostile environment if we're talking about sports and I'm constantly picking on the Dallas Cowboy fan that works in my office? Am I creating a hostile environment? Right, it depends on, is it offensive to that person? The type of language that I'm using? Right, if I'm using derogatory terms or something of that nature, that could be affecting their work environment. Right, the Dallas Cowboy fan might not want to come to work on Monday morning if I'm constantly badgering him about his team using derogatory terms. That's kind of a silly example, but you see where I'm going with that. If we're using terms, if we're using language, if we're using jokes, that could be offensive in nature, and if somebody's telling us that that behavior is unwanted or unwelcome, either through their verbal or nonverbal cues, what is our obligation to do? Don't do it, right? Change your behavior. Stop doing it. So is the conduct first physical or verbal? Does that matter? Does somebody have to slap you across the face for you to know that their behavior is not welcome. So we don't have to do that, right? We can use no, we can use our words, we can use nonverbal cues as well. How frequently is the conduct repeated? Does that matter when it comes to a hostile environment? Do you have to feel unwelcome at work? Is that something that has to occur repeatedly, or can that be a one-time deal that happens? Depends, right? Depends on how the person is receiving those cues. If your behavior was so severe that it created an environment for this person that they no longer want to be around, then we could have a hostile environment that's being created there. Is the conduct blatantly offensive? Does that have to be a condition? What's blatant offensive behavior? What's that? Maybe I shouldn't ask for examples. It doesn't have to be blatant. Can it be subversive type behavior? Absolutely it can be. Right? Are we talking about this person constantly? Are we making comments about their physical appearance to the point where it's creating an environment that person doesn't feel comfortable, doesn't want to come to work in? Does it matter if the harasser is a coworker or a supervisor? No, it doesn't. It doesn't even matter if the person is employed by the employer. This could be a contractor that's coming in. Yes, ma'am?
What about a student? Could a student create a hostile work environment for us?
Could be a student. Could be the student's parents, the grandparents, aunt and uncle. Could be anybody that's coming into the facility. The employer has an obligation to protect the employees, right? And if that behavior is unwanted and unwelcome, and you've made it known, then absolutely that behavior could be coming from an outside source. Okay, we have an example of that. I think I used this example last year. But we had a young woman who was working for us as an intern in our office. She was sitting at the front desk receiving packages, answering phone calls, things of that nature. The UPS driver came in a couple of times, or FedEx, and would ask her for her phone number. Was asking her if she had a boyfriend, asking her on dates. She kept rejecting his advances to the point where she felt uncomfortable when he came in. She made us as an employer aware that that was going on. Our obligation at that point was to put an end to that behavior. We had to call FedEx and tell them that their driver was no longer welcome in our facility. They needed to find a new driver to come to our facility because he was making our employee feel uncomfortable. How did we know that that behavior was unwanted? She told us, right? If she hadn't told us and the behavior was happening, then how can we fix it? So you have to let somebody know. If you see something, if something's happening to you, if something's happening to somebody else, report that type of behavior to your supervisor, to human resources, to your administration, and let them investigate, let them find out what can be done to change that behavior. Okay, let them go through that process. Was the harassment conducted by more than one person? It doesn't matter if it's one person, 5 people, it could be an entire group of people that's ostracizing somebody from their department based on their gender, based on their identity, based on who they are. That could be creating a hostile environment for them to work in. Okay, the sports analogy that I used earlier. If I've got a Dallas Cowboy fan in the office, and we've got 10 people that work for us that are men and 1 female employee, as soon as the female employee comes in, we stop talking about football. Is that right? Is that behavior that could be offensive to that female employee? Could be, right? If we're treating her differently based on the fact that she's not men, based on the fact of what her gender is. So that conduct could be directed by more than one person, could be a group of employees. So how do we make sure that we're not creating that type of environment? Looking at different forms of harassment. Harassing behavior does not have to be verbal. It can also be nonverbal, such as visual, written, and physical. Anyone think of some examples of written harassment? Text messages, Facebook posts, using social media, right? Other forms of communication could be creating a hostile environment, could be sexually harassing behavior if the people who are receiving that message are offended by it. right? So if you're posting pictures, if you're sending text messages, and it could be a written message, a joke, for example, something that you think is funny, somebody else might find offensive. And if that behavior is offensive and they've asked you not to do it, you have an obligation then to not do that. Physical. What are some forms of sexual harassment that could be of a physical nature? Absolutely. Yeah. In the United States, we have a personal space, right, which is about arm's length. About 3 feet is where we feel comfortable having people in our bubble, in our personal space. Other cultures have different levels of personal space, but typically in the United States, our space is about the arm's length. And when somebody approaches on that physical space, how do you react? For some people, we don't like to be touched. If you touch us, we're going to cringe. We might move. We tense up. It's our fight or flight instinct that's kicking in. It's that little thing in your brain that causes you to either fight or flight, right? It's causing you to react in a certain way. And you might tense up. You might skirt away, move to a different part of the room. If somebody's doing that and you're the person that's touching them, you have an obligation to stop that behavior. Take that clue from people. Even if you're the person that likes to give everyone a hug, if there's that one person that doesn't appreciate that behavior, they're letting you know with their behavior. And it doesn't always have to be physically or verbally letting you know. It could be in a physical nature by moving away from you. So we need to read each other's clues. Visual. Some examples of harassing behavior of a visual nature. This is not written, it's not verbal. This is of a visual nature. Staring at somebody. Yeah, making eyes at somebody. Watching somebody enter the room, watching them walk away as they leave the room. That type of behavior could be considered offensive to that person if they don't appreciate it. So let me show you some examples here. Discussing sexual activities, unnecessary touching, commenting on somebody's physical attributes. Is it sexual harassment for me to comment on somebody's hair? For me to say, that's a nice haircut that you have? Not necessarily, right? But what if that person feels like I'm making advances towards them by commenting on their physical attributes? If they've told me that they don't want that type of comment made about them, or they've told somebody else about those types of comments, then I need to discontinue that type of behavior. Does that mean that you can't talk to anybody about their haircut? No, it just means we need to read each other and understand what's wanted and what's unwanted behavior. Displaying sexually suggestive pictures. If you've got a screensaver of the Dallas Cowboy cheerleaders on your computer, first of all, you shouldn't be using screensavers. Your IT department or your energy management department will tell you, right? They want you to use screensavers. But if you've got something like that, that could be considered sexually offensive to somebody. If you've got pictures in your office, pictures in your warehouse, pictures in your classroom that are sexually suggestive. Using demeaning or inappropriate terms, such as babe, honey, dear, darling, those types of things could be considered offensive if the person that's receiving that message is offended by it, right? So there's some conditions that have to be met. Doesn't mean every time you call somebody babe that it's offensive. But if it is offensive to somebody, we need to discontinue that behavior. Ostracizing workers of one gender. Granting job favors to those who participate in consensual activities. Using crude or offensive language. Letters, notes, telephone calls. And I would add social media to that list of letters, notes, and telephone calls. Social media. Be careful using social media, especially with people that you work with. We've seen Eeoc cases, actual cases that have come through the Eeoc. There was one in particular that stood out to me last year that I read about. There was a supervisor who was friends with everybody on his team. One employee made an allegation against him. He took her off his friend list on Facebook, changed his behavior towards that person after the allegation was made against him. What do we have going on now? Retaliation. And that's exactly what the Eeoc found. They determined that his behavior towards that employee changed after the allegation was made. Even though the allegation was unfounded, the initial allegation, he changed his behavior towards that person by taking her off his Facebook list, his list of friends. He's now ostracizing her. He's now treating her differently than the rest of the employees on his team. So if you supervise employees, I would be careful becoming friends on social media platforms. Definitely want to make sure that we're not doing that with students as well. As your district, you adopted the boundaries policy. The boundaries policy creates clear lines between appropriate behaviors between staff and students. Students shouldn't have your personal cell phone numbers. You shouldn't be sending messages through social media platforms to students. There's alternate ways that you can communicate with your students that don't involve personal cell phones and social media accounts. Sexually suggestive graffiti is another example of sexual harassment. I think I talked about this example last year, but your off-duty conduct could also be determined to cause a hostile environment. This is a very long paragraph that you're not going to be able to read from where you're sitting, so instead of reading it to you, I'll summarize it. Basically, what happened after work in this example, a group of employees went down to a local bar. They were having happy hour drinks on a Friday afternoon. One employee was telling sexually offensive jokes to the group. Supervisor was in attendance, and the supervisor, hearing the sexually offensive jokes, didn't say anything to the employee about it. Allowed the behavior to continue. Thought about it over the weekend. On Monday morning, he got to work and decided, I'm not going to talk to this guy about it. We're going to let it go. Was he right or wrong? He was wrong, right? Because in the eye of the court, what was happening there, by not addressing that behavior as the supervisor, he was allowing a potentially hostile environment to be created in his workplace. A supervisor is going to be held to a higher level of standard. Okay, again, I'd be careful socializing with your employees when you're in a supervisory position. Your duty doesn't end when your duty day ends. Your duty as a supervisor extends even outside of work, even on social media platforms, on things that you might think are innocent, things that you think we're just having a good time. You're still a representative of the management of your organization. And in the court's mind, you don't have to have direct supervision of employees. You could have a lead position. A lead position is a title. Doesn't necessarily mean you make more money, doesn't mean that you are supervising people. If you have a lead position, you might be the head of the science department, the head of the English department. You're considered a manager at that point in the eye of the court. You're a lead employee, and your duties are elevated to make sure that you're addressing anything that you think could become an offensive behavior. Does that mean the supervisor should have gone in and fired his employee on Monday morning? No. But if you would have talked to him about the nature of the jokes he was telling, he would have kept himself from getting in trouble. Remind the employee that some people might have found his behavior to be offensive. Documenting it. Putting it in writing somewhere. The employee's behavior was inappropriate. It could create a hostile environment because the impact carries over to the workplace. Right? We don't have memories that erase right after something happens. Things carry with us. And we might bring that back to work with us. And that's when we might have a hostile environment being created. Federal and state courts have found that an employer can be liable for an employee's off-duty conduct. Observing that conduct taking place outside of the workplace has a tendency to permeate into the workplace. And the court states that defendants in an appropriate case may be liable as the harasser's employer because the alleged harassment, even though the alleged harassment took place off-duty. Okay, so the courts are finding that. Employers have a right to even control certain aspects of employees' conduct. They might have certain policies with regard to the types of relationships you can have with each other if you're in an employer-employee, supervisor-to-employee type of relationship. Okay, so that's why you have fraternization policies in certain companies, or you have non-dating policies, non-relationship types of policies in certain employers. So it's something to keep in mind. How this affects education. You know, I talked a little bit before we get to the videos. The videos are I think I showed the videos last year, so they're going to cause us to laugh and have some discussion, hopefully, as a result of it. But before we get there, let's talk a little bit more about education. Let's talk about Title IX. Title IX, the reason why that's now, the Supreme Court got involved with that was a case involving a little girl by the name of LaShonda Davis. LaShonda Davis was a student, straight A student in Monroe, Louisiana. She was a great student, had perfect attendance, perfect grades. She was being harassed. She was being treated poorly by classmates in her school. She was being, in some cases, you could consider it to be assault was taking place. She was being grabbed. She was being groped. She was being assaulted by the boys in her class. Her parents and the little girl brought the behavior to the school's attention. Nothing was done about it. Behaviors weren't changed. In fact, what they did was they moved LaShonda from one class to another. They moved her to a different classroom to get away from the boys who were perpetrating that type of behavior. What happened was it affected LaShonda's grades. She stopped wanting to go to school. She stopped performing well in school. Her parents sued the school district for creating a hostile environment. And they won. They went all the way to the Supreme Court. And the Supreme Court ruled that the school district, by not intervening, by not doing anything to just change the behavior, rather than what they considered was punishment by moving her to a different classroom, they affected her ability to receive an education. And that's why Title IX has now become more predominant in schools. Not necessarily for the athletic part that we hear about in the news, but what's happening in universities and colleges. Penn State, for example, Ohio State. Colleges are being brought to their knees financially as a result of cases that are going through Title IX, going through as a result of sexual harassment. Behavior that's not being changed, behavior that's not being affected. So I would encourage you, if you see any kind of behavior that's offensive, even if it's not employee to student, but any kind of behavior, even if it's student to student type behavior, that you do something about it. Don't just allow the school to turn a blind eye to it. Don't turn your head on that type of behavior. That gets brought in, the entire school becomes responsible for that. And that includes behavior amongst yourselves. If you see something going on, report it. If you see something happening between an adult and a child, something that doesn't seem right to you, I can't encourage you enough. I just read another case today. It was in a different state. It was a $450 million lawsuit settlement, and I think it was Iowa, as a result of sexual assault on students, child abuse. We're seeing that in our state. I can tell you in the last year it's become more difficult for school districts to obtain liability insurance for those types of claims because of the predominance of their lawsuits and what's happening nationwide. LA Unified Schools just paid out over $500 billion in lawsuits over the last 10 years as a result of assault, children being abused in schools. It's happening, we're seeing it in colleges, we're seeing it in churches, large institutions that are being bankrupted, trying to pay out the behavior that's happening that's inexcusable behavior. So if you see something that doesn't seem right to you, it's probably not right. Say something about it. Bring it to somebody's attention. So, that being said, do I have any questions up to this point on anything that we've talked about so far? No questions? Okay, I'm going to play a video for you here, and then we'll talk about whether or not you think this is sexual harassment or not. Some of you probably remember the video from last year. I don't remember if my sound worked or not, though. Did the sound work last year? Do you remember? You want to remember? 2 years ago. That behavior constitutes sexual harassment. Does anybody feel like that woman was being harassed by that man? Or maybe the man was being harassed by the woman? What's that? She was flirting back? Anybody think she was flirting with him? Does anybody strongly feel she was not flirting with him? She wasn't flirting with him, in your opinion. What was she doing? Minding her business. Did she reject his behavior? Does anybody think she was rejecting his behavior? No one thinks she was rejecting. So do we have sexual harassment if she wasn't rejecting his behavior?
Maybe.
Was it being overly sensitive? Maybe. Somebody said maybe. Who thinks maybe we have sexual harassment? Why do you think it's maybe?
Because I still don't think it's clear on how she felt.
Yeah, maybe we need more information to figure out how she felt, right? But could it constitute sexual harassment even though she didn't outright say no to him? Yeah, it could. Maybe she's getting her jacket so she can leave the establishment, so she can get away from his advancements. We don't know.
But isn't that the key in her hand?
Yeah, he dropped the key off and she picked it up, right? So does that mean she's willing participant, or does that mean anything with regard to sexual harassment? We are making some assumptions, right? Because we don't have the full picture. What else do we not know about this scenario? It could be her husband. Yeah. Do they work together? Is this happening in a place of employment? We don't know. We don't have enough information, right? So let's add some additional information. Let's say they're in Albuquerque, they're two educators, they're there for a conference. He's the principal or superintendent, and she's his subordinate. She's a teacher, or she works for him in some capacity. He's the boss. Now, does that change anything?
Yeah, huh?
She said, what's that again?
We're making assumptions because dropping off the key could be, this is the car key, go get the files you left there.
Yeah, it could be, right? We have no idea. We're making some assumptions. Do you think maybe it could be sexual harassment?
Yeah, if they're working together.
If they work together, it might be inappropriate behavior, right? At the very least, it could be inappropriate because of the fact that they work together, right? So maybe it's better not to cross that line with somebody that you work with because assumptions might be made because we don't know what's happening, who they are. Can two people work in the same place that are married? Yeah, happens all the time. I see a lot of districts where you've got employees that are married, that are dating, things of that nature. Now, if the policy states that you can't have that kind of relationship at work, now you have a different story. But just because the fact two people work together does not make that sexual harassment, we probably need some more information, right? So we're not making assumptions on this. What about, so we talked about the rejection, whether any existed or not. How about hostile environment? Could that be creating a hostile environment for her? We established maybe it's not quid pro quo, but how about hostile environment? Somebody said no up there. Why do you think it's not a hostile environment? We don't know, right? We still probably need a little bit more information, but could it be a hostile environment? Could she be offended by the fact that he came and dropped off his motel key on her table? Yeah, could be. Now, it depends on what we do with that information, right? Does she reject the behavior? Does she tell him no? Does she, in some way, reject that behavior? Or let somebody know that that behavior was happening and she did not welcome that behavior, right? I had a case that I read about. It was actually somebody that I worked with. A man was accused of sexual harassment because he held the door open for somebody. He held the door open for a woman. She walked through the door and accused him of sexual harassment. She accused him of treating her differently because she was a woman. He held the door open for her because she was a woman. Does that constitute a hostile environment? Does that constitute sexual harassment? What's that? In her mind, it did, right? So does that make his behavior right or wrong? We don't have enough information, right? But what happened was the case was investigated, and it was determined that it was not sexual harassment. He's a nice guy. He holds the door open for everybody. Nobody else could say that he was only holding the door open because of her gender. It was not proven that the reason why he did that was based on her gender or based on any kind of advance or request for favor, anything like that. So the case was investigated and it was determined that it was not sexual harassment. In her mind, it was, though. It's okay to have that investigation be done. It's okay to talk about those types of behaviors so that we can find out what the root cause was, what the true nature of it was. Now, if he treats her differently as a result of the fact that she made that allegation, now we cross a line into retaliation. So if he sees her walking up and he slams the door in her face, what's going to happen to her? He's going to get accused of retaliation, treating her differently as a result of the allegation that she made. We want to be in an environment where we feel free to talk about those types of behaviors. Whether it's wrong or right, we still need to go through the investigation process. The employer has to find out the circumstances. They have to go through the investigation process. You can't just make assumptions. We have to investigate. We have to drill down further to find out what happened and why somebody felt that behavior constituted a hostile environment or a quid pro quo or some other form of sexual harassment. Now let's find out a little bit more about our couple here. Let's watch the video in its entirety. So does that change your opinion in any way? Got a little bit more information there, right? Did she reject his advance? That was a pretty clear rejection, right? So,
That's
now she's
right.
like harassing the other guy. Yeah, what was he doing? He's just sitting there minding his own business and she comes and drops the key on him. Is that harassing behavior on her part towards him? Could be, right? Depends on the circumstances. We don't know. We don't know enough information to try to look at that. Does the music that's playing throughout that make a difference? I've played this video before where I can't get the sound to work. If you were watching that in silence, which I think that happened here last year when I was showing it, or the last time I was here doing this training, I think we couldn't get the sound to work. I didn't have my speakers. Does that make a difference? Yeah, it's, the sultry music, but what you've got there is a circumstance where there's somebody making an advance, right? Somebody's making some sort of suggestion, possibly. How's that being received? That's really what this boils down to, is how is your message being received? If it's met with some sort of rejection, then now we're crossing the line, okay? And it's not just with things of a sexual nature, but other types of behavior. If you're telling jokes of a religious nature, of a racial nature, if you're making comments about somebody based on who they are, what they look like, where they come from, what language they speak, what color their skin is, we're crossing the line. Because you don't know how that message is going to be received by anyone else, whether it's the people that you're talking to or somebody that might be overhearing what you're saying. In the workplace, we want to have stability. Stability means we're treating each other with respect, with value, with professionalism. You're all well-educated educators, award-winning educators, right? We want to make sure that we're treating each other with the respect and the value, the professionalism that profession demands. So when you're telling jokes, think about how are these jokes being received by the people who I'm telling them to, by people that may be listening. I don't even have to be a party to it. If I'm walking down the hall and I hear two people making racially insensitive jokes or sexually suggestive jokes, you could be creating a hostile environment for other people. If you're telling stories about somebody who's from a different country, who looks differently than you do, who wears different clothing than you do, we're seeing a lot more expression with kids, especially, in terms of their physicality, their sexuality. if we're making comments about things like that, telling jokes, how is that being received? If you hear kids talking about that, telling each other jokes, are you doing anything to change that environment? Are you doing anything to curtail it, to stop it from happening? If you've got kids telling racially insensitive jokes, religious jokes, sexually offensive jokes, what are you doing about it? That's Title IX. That goes back to the LaShonda Davis case. If you don't do anything about it, then you're not changing your culture. You're allowing it to permeate. And you could be creating a hostile environment for somebody. Civility is demonstrated through our manners, our courtesy, politeness, and awareness of each other's rights, wishes, concerns, and feelings. We don't always have to agree on everything. We can disagree about things, but we need to be respectful of one another when we do. We need to, instead of taking an example from our national level, bring it back to a more local level and treat each other the way that we grew up, the way that we've talked to each other our whole lives. Change that environment in your workplace. It matters because people don't want to work in places where there's no civility. If you work somewhere and there's no civility, there's incivility, we allow hostile environment to be created, people leave. Those are proven through statistics. We know that recruitment changes. Schools change. Kids leave your districts when there's a lack of civility. When we have bullying, when we have abuse, when we have assault happening in schools, we see kids choose to go to school somewhere else. They choose to leave districts, and where does that leave those districts? I've actually read stories of districts in New Mexico that kids are crossing state lines to go to schools in other states. They live in New Mexico, they're going to school in other states because of the culture in the schools that they're living in. That doesn't have to happen. We can change that. The price of incivility and disrespect, it causes turnover, it causes lost productivity. Accidents happen more frequently. Absenteeism goes up. People don't come to work in a place they don't feel respected. They find reasons not to. Legitimate reasons or otherwise. They find reasons not to come to work if the civility doesn't exist in their workplace. Has anyone ever worked somewhere where you just didn't want to go there? You didn't want to be there. You felt disrespected. You felt not valued. Has anyone ever worked in an environment like that? And what did you do about it? You leave. You quit. You go somewhere else. Don't cross the line. When we build a workplace that's characterized by civility, professionalism, dignity, and mutual respect, then we don't cross the line into incivility and disrespect. Once we cross those lines, now we get into discrimination, harassment, hostile environment, workplace bullying, other types of bullying, cyberbullying, other types of behaviors that are unwanted. And it doesn't matter what your intent was, right? You don't have to intend to insult somebody for somebody to be insulted. You don't have to intend to be offensive in order for your behavior or your language to be offensive. Behavior is assessed from the perspective of the victim. That's where the legal ground is going to stand from. The legal standard is from the perspective of the eye of the beholder. Then the investigation goes from there. But we always take the investigation from the eye of the beholder. The person that feels like they were discriminated against, the person who feels like they were harassed, why did they feel that way? And we're going to go from there. We're going to do the investigation from that perspective. Okay? What do you see in this picture? A rabbit? Does anybody see something other than a rabbit? A duck? You can have the same picture that looks different to two different people. To the same person, it might look different. You can see two sides of it. How about this picture? An old lady, a young woman, same picture, two different perspectives, right? Just because your behavior is not offensive to you, just because it's not offensive to the person sitting next to you, doesn't mean that you're not crossing the line with somebody else. So what are some ways that you can keep yourself out of that type of situation? First of all, be aware. Okay? Be awake. Pay attention. How is my behavior being received? Are people leaving the room when I start talking? Are people leaving the room when I start telling jokes? Are people walking away from me, not making eye contact? When I show them what's on my phone, when I show them things that I'm talking about? Be aware of your behavior. Be aware of how that's being received by other people. Pay attention to those cues. If somebody says no, if somebody says stop, don't cross the line. Once you do, you could be encroaching into that hostile environment territory. Sexually offensive behavior is always in the eye of the beholder. Right? It doesn't matter what your intent was. It matters how the message was received and what was done about it. Did we reject the behavior in some way? If you feel like you're being offended, if you feel like you're being harassed, discriminated against, it's your obligation to let somebody know about that. Talk to your supervisor. If you don't feel comfortable talking to your supervisor, talk to your human resource department, talk to your administration, talk to somebody. If you have a union, talk to your union representative. Talk to somebody about what's going on. We can't expect the administration to know what's happening with everybody's minds and everybody's feelings. It has to be expressed in some way. Okay? Once that happens, an investigation should take place. That means the obligation of the employer to make sure that we're taking all claims, all allegations seriously and investigating them. Even the guy that was accused of harassment for holding the door open for somebody, we still have to investigate and find out what was happening. Because it could have been some sort of behavior that was offensive. In that particular case, it wasn't, but it doesn't mean that it's not always. Right? So be aware, pay attention, and observe and report when you see something that feels wrong. That's not right to you. Does anybody have any questions for me? Yes.
You drew kind of a gray line there between not treating somebody different and not continuing the same thing that's bothering them.
Yeah, and so the question there is the gray line between not treating somebody differently, but making sure that we're addressing the behavior if somebody makes you aware that the behavior is unwanted, right? The difference there is, was that behavior, was the rejection told directly to you? Okay, did I tell you to stop telling me the offensive jokes, so you stop telling the jokes? Did I make an allegation? Did I make a claim? That's the distinction. Okay, did I go to the point of making the claim of the allegation? It was investigated, and now you're treating me differently because I made the allegation. That's the distinction between those two things. If somebody's telling you no, stop the behavior. Change your behavior. If somebody goes to your supervisor and tells them, I don't like the way that you're telling jokes, I don't like the nature of the language that you're using, whatever the case may be, you want to change your behavior. Don't treat the person differently, but change your behavior. Right? We're not going to ostracize them. That doesn't mean when you come in the room, I'm going to leave because I'm afraid to say anything to you. Now I'm retaliating against you. If I completely ostracize you, now I'm retaliating. I can change my behavior without ostracizing. Right? You do need a level of maturity. And that comes with accepting the fact that sometimes not everything we do is right. Sometimes we make mistakes, and it's okay to acknowledge that mistake and learn from it. Even though you don't feel like it was a mistake, in somebody else's mind it might have been. The joke that you were telling, the language you were using, may have been offensive to somebody. Are you mature enough to change your behavior without ostracizing that person as a result of them making that known that you were offensive to them? That's what it comes down to. That's civility. That's how you would want to be treated. If somebody was insulting you and you told them about it. That's how you would want your kids to be treated. That's how you would want your significant others to be treated. With respect and maturity. With civility. That's what it comes down to. Did that answer your question? Anybody else? Any other questions? Comments? Concerns? Time for trick or treat? It's almost 2:10. You did pretty good. I told you I'd be done by 2:15. Is there anything else? Any other questions? If there are no other questions, please be sure that you signed in so that your district can make sure that they documented the fact that you've attended this training.